All right, great. Welcome to any new Bridge AOR members and affiliates. Thank you so much for joining us, as well as the rest of the membership that has joined us today. We have a very special speaker for you today, and you guys already know this because you signed up and registered for the event. But with that being said, we have tons of events all the time. You guys know that, and Zoom has been a great platform for which to host great speakers. They no longer have to fly in. They can come join us from the comfort of their own office or living room. And so we have a great opportunity for these wonderful speakers to come speak with you. And today, and of course, if you can always join or look at our website and see upcoming events. So please do, make sure to check our calendar from time to time to see what's coming up. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today. His name is Jordan Levine. He is CAR's Chief Economist and VP over at CAR. Jordan is responsible for CAR's housing market and economic research, as well as the policy analysis for CAR's legislative and governmental affairs efforts. And me being the government affairs director for Bridge Association of Realtors, I am very, very much interested in what Jordan has to bring to the table, and I'm always listening. So, Jordan brings a lot of passion for homeownership. He's actively involved in the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and he regularly represents CAR to its members, the real estate industry, policymakers, and in the local and national field. Jordan has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's degree with merit in international economics from the University of Sussex. Prior to joining CAR, Jordan worked in consulting as an economist and director of economic research, where he oversaw all research and economic analysis on California's economy and housing market. And he regularly speaks to trade unions, public officials, businesses, and the media. So without further ado, Mr. Jordan Levine, please take it away.
Kieran, thank you so much. And thank you for having me back. I always take that as a sign that I didn't screw it up too bad last time, and appreciate the opportunity to address the members. I'm going to share my screen so I don't traumatize you all too bad with my face, and also because I have a lot of good pictures that I think highlight why we're still relatively optimistic about the future trajectory of the broader economy, and also the housing market in particular. I guess I should mention that I'll send these to Emily and Jake, these slides and stuff after the event, so that you guys have them. If there's a follow-up email, I'll also make sure they're out on car.org so that you can download them there if you need to as well. Hopefully they're helpful to refer back to. I'll also try and keep an eye on the chat as best I can if you have any questions that come up in real time, but I'll be happy to answer questions at the end as well if there's time, and Kieran hasn't ripped me off with the shepherd's hook yet or anything like that. So, ultimately, I think the bottom line is, as we look out across the broader landscape, for the housing market and the economy, is that we can still be relatively optimistic. I think that there are increasing headwinds, and it's definitely not an environment where we're going to be able to, throw our business in cruise control. But when you look at the kind of 30,000 foot macroeconomic perspective, right? We both have now the kind of the twin sources of optimism, one being that the economy continues to move in the right direction, and number two being that the public health situation has really started to improve dramatically over the course of the last couple of weeks. And of course, drilling down specifically into housing, even with the increase in interest rates that we've seen recently, we just put out our January 2022 numbers, and the market's still holding up relatively well thus far. We do see more signs of a market that's starting to normalize or continuing to normalize. So, I got small kids, so we're always thinking about things in terms of like the 5 W's, right? The who, what, where, when, and why. But you're starting to see trends in that area whether it's what people are buying, where folks are buying the homes, et cetera, that it's not necessarily back to normal, but it's looking more like it did before the crisis than it did in May of 2020, as an example. And so we have seen, a lot of reversion back to a mean, is what the econ nerds would say. But yet at the same time, we also have this kind of acceleration of the underlying structural changes. We've had supply issues that have plagued us for a long time that have led to, affordability issues and things like that. And that's caused, at least at the margins, things like out migration to happen, moving to the suburbs, moving deeper inland, outside of Sacramento and things like that. And I think that even as we start to see this kind of homegrown demand of home buyer demand in the core Bay Area start to kind of reassert itself, we're also seeing at the margins more folks being, forced out to places like Yolo and Tracy and, San Joaquin County and things like that. And so both of those kind of trends are coexisting, if you will. And I think that's going to be one of the lasting features, right? Is that we have more flexibility, more people working remote, et cetera, et cetera. And so even as we're kind of optimistic, I think for me, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that there are some significant challenges that are going to mean we really need to still maintain a kind of elbow grease mentality when it comes to the market. Of course, we have the inflation, which I already alluded to, the rising rates that go along with that, and what that does to things like housing affordability, home ownership. And of course, that's before we get into all the kind of crazy stuff happening in the industry, whether it's, iBuyers or the portals or what's going on with the MLSs and NAR and the DOJ having all these conflicts, et cetera. For me, the biggest challenge is kind of our evergreen challenge, and that is on supply, both in terms of, the number of listings that are showing up on the MLS, but also, kind of in an indirectly related way, the amount of homes that we're actually building in California. And so when you put it all together, I think even though we're optimistic about the broader economy, even though we think that the housing market in a kind of macro sense will continue to do well, at the individual realtor practitioner level, I think that it means we're still in an environment where we're going to be working harder than ever. You're going to have buyers who you've got to do a lot of legwork to get those offers accepted. The market's still incredibly competitive, especially relative to the thin amount of listings. So you're going to have to work twice as hard just to get those buyers actually into a closed transaction. And on the listing side, there's, fewer and fewer listings to go around, particularly from the standpoint of a realtor population that's now almost, bigger than ever. That's one of the kind of byproducts of having a housing market that outperforms, is now the realtor population has also swelled, and yet the number of new listings coming onto the MLS hasn't swelled. And so I think that even as we're kind of relatively enthusiastic, shall we say, about the 30,000 foot perspective, I still think it's very much a nose to the grindstone type of environment for you as an individual realtor out there. The conditions are there for you to have your best year ever, but you just want to make sure that you don't kind of interpret the positive economic trends as a license to go ahead and kick your feet up on the desk and ride this tidal wave of closed transactions that will be coming in this year. The reason why I kind of take that minute to throw the wet blanket on is because things are looking relatively well. These are job losses during the pandemic. California lost about 2.7 million jobs. Here's how they broke out across the state, right? And what you can see is that, the East Bay lost about 16% of its non-farm employment base. That was, pretty much middle of the pack in terms of orders of magnitude, right? What you can see on the left-hand side is that resort markets like Napa, Marin, Santa Cruz, Monterey, San Luis Obispo, where I live, parts of the state where there's an above average concentration on things like bars, hotels, restaurants as a share of the overall economy, were disproportionately affected. Those were the jobs that are not able to be remote when we're stuck in our home, in our homes because of lockdown. We're not going on vacation and staying at the Hilton, Carmel by the sea and all of that stuff, right? And so those areas were disproportionately affected. But the good news is that we're seeing really broad-based recovery across the state. So here they're sorted in that exact same order. going up to 100%, which areas, how much of each area is recovered. And there you can see that the East Bay is pretty much 60% of the way towards full recovery. It's a little bit behind the state as a whole, which is about 70% of the way towards full economic recovery, but pretty broad-based progress nonetheless. And for me, that's probably one of the most encouraging things, not just that we're almost 70% of the way towards full economic recovery, but that we are seeing that, across virtually all parts of the state, including some of those areas that were hardest hit, losing more than 1 out of 5 jobs at the height of the crisis. The other thing is the consistency of the recovery, right? And so again, I hate to drag you through all these kind of, economic numbers, but I do think that it sets the stage for why we can be optimistic about housing going forward. And here you can see those 2.7 million jobs that we lost back in 2020 here in California. And for me, I think it's important to note that, we've already recovered a little bit less than 2 million of those, about 1.9 million and change of those lost jobs have already been added back. But it's not just that we're about 3/4 of a million jobs short of those pre-crisis levels. For me, it's more that the recovery has been relatively consistent, even with all the ups and downs of the COVID numbers and the kind of start and stop herky-jerkiness of the broader, environment. The jobs numbers have been moving forward at a very consistent clip. So that to me is even more encouraging than the fact that we're 70% of the way recovered, right? And so moving in the right direction, but doing so in a consistent way. In fact, this is one of the areas where now California started to outpace the rest of the United States. These dark blue bars here, and you can see that California had a bigger hole to climb out of economically. We went harder, faster, for longer on COVID, but once the recovery got underway, it only took a couple of months for California to start outperforming the rest of the United States again, economically. And that's something that we've been doing for the last 6 months in a row. Of course, we had a bigger hole to climb out of, as I said, but growing faster now. So the kind of economic wind, as it were, is at our back. And I chose jobs because those are the ones where the rubber really meets the road in terms of the economic data and the housing market. But you could see that when you look at incomes, when you look at spending, there's a whole slew of kind of positive macro data that kind of all tells the same story. The other thing that I think we have going for us this year is that there really has been not just the cyclical improvement after this enormous hit in 2020 to our economy. There's also been this kind of renewed passion for home ownership. We do an annual housing market survey every year where we talk to several thousand realtors across the state. And we saw now for the second year in a row, elevated levels of first-time home buyers. In 2020, those numbers were at a decade high. They came down a little bit last year, but still, basically at the highest levels we've seen in a long time. And one of the kind of byproducts of the specific nature of a pandemic, right? Usually housing is cyclical, right? When the economy goes down, housing goes down. This time we had this kind of counter-cyclical response because our homes we're asking them to do so much more for us now than ever before. And on top of that, the folks who were kind of in that pool of potential home buyers in California, just given where housing affordability was and housing supply, et cetera, those were the workers that were relatively insulated from the effects of the crisis. If you could do your job remotely, if you worked in tech, et cetera, you remained employed, you weren't commuting, you were saving all this money, and you needed a house that was going to do more than just be a place where you went home and laid your head on the pillow before you head out to work the next day. It had to be somewhere where you lived, worked, homeschooled. It was your gym. It was it was everything. And what we saw in the survey data was that, you all told us that motivated a lot of these long-term high-income renters to finally take that leap into home ownership and get their foot on the property ladder for the very first time. The other thing that you told us was that there was a lot of folks who already own property out there buying even more property, right? Buying vacation homes, buying second homes, taking a shot at flipping homes. And I'll show you the investment numbers there in a second as well. But this all kind of signals this voracious appetite for housing, driven primarily by the specific nature of this crisis. And so again, you had a lot of these folks, getting into housing for the first time, and a lot of people out there buying even more. In fact, 2020 and the census data is even further behind than anyone when it comes to reporting on data, but they just in December released the 2020 American Community Survey, and we finally saw some progress in terms of overall home ownership here in California. And so this kind of corroborates what you all told us in our annual housing market survey. A lot of interest from first-time buyers, many of those actually getting into housing. They just tended to be at the high end of the income spectrum with big down payments, great credit scores, and obviously remaining employed. So that's good news, right? Is that kind of American dream is alive and well, and potentially even more rekindled now than it has been in a lot of years, particularly amongst young folks. And of course, that really mattered for us when it came to the market last year, right? 2021, we can now say was the best year for home sales here in California in a decade. Depending on the market, it was potentially even higher than that. Actually, I think in California, it was the best year since 2009, which is about a 12-year window there, with about 450,000 units closed. And that was, again, better. We struggled to really get above 400,000 for the better part of the last decade. And even with elevated levels of unemployment, kind of, pandemics and PED forms and masks and all this stuff, we continued to have a housing market that outperformed the broader economy, again, reaching its highest level in over a decade when it came to closed transactions. Of course, it's fun to be in this group right now because we did even better than that locally, right? You can see the statewide number, that 445,000 units or so was about an 8% increase from where we were in 2020. Alameda County had a 21.5% increase, right? So we did a little bit more than twice as well as the rest of the state, with pretty solid growth across the board, right? I called out Oakland and Berkeley first, but then I'm showing you the rest of Alameda County, and with the exception of Castro Valley, where the inventory numbers are especially tight, we saw double-digit growth across the board when it came to closed transactions. So this wasn't just stuff that was happening out in Bakersfield and people buying cabins in Tahoe or anything like that. We saw some real honest-to-goodness growth in the local market, and a lot of that, momentum is maintained through the first month of the year. January, although down about 8% from January of 2021. We're still running at about a 445,000 unit pace, which is, again, higher than that pre-pandemic average, and still a relatively healthy number. Again, another sign of that kind of voracious appetite for housing and that surge in buyer demand is that we saw median home prices rise to a new all-time high level. The quaint $350,000 median home price in the rest of the United States is now, dwarfed by prices here in California. And this is an annual number. Actually, the monthly stuff and the daily, the median closed prices are even higher. So just, again, incredible demand for housing, really buttoned right up against our lack of inventory. And of course, prices in the local market have risen substantially as well. You can see this is the January 2022 data for Alameda County. And really you're talking about a vast majority of the local market is now in excess of $1 million in terms of median closed prices. So again, a lot of this stuff happening right here at home. Of course, folks weren't just competing on price, right? It was just an incredibly competitive market. We had so many folks who wanted home ownership, wanted to take advantage of low rates, had the flexibility, were economically insulated from the crisis. They were bidding up home prices, but they were also finding all kinds of other creative ways to make sure that theirs was the offer that gets accepted. And you can see the percentage of realtors that said in their last transaction they had a non-contingent offer, that they didn't have a contingency for an appraisal, was almost half the members that we talked to. About 1 out of 3 either didn't have an inspection done or didn't have any contingencies related to what was turned up on that inspection. And so just again, a kind of symptom of this hyper competitive and insatiable demand for the market out there. In fact, if you look locally, right, and I think in California that we peaked statewide at about 72% of transactions closing above asking price. Here we're talking about 8, 9 out of 10 of the transactions that closed last year closed above the actual list price on the MLS, which is another symptom of just this incredible appetite for housing. In fact, one of the things that I thought was, had me scratching my head at first was why all cash sales went up in 2021. If you got the lowest interest rates of all time, why would you use your own money? Well, the answer is you've got a gun to your head proverbially, because the market is so competitive. And this is just yet another way that folks compete. I'd rather use the bank's money than my own. But if it means that, I'm going to get the house instead of somebody else, then you start to see that kind of calculus playing itself out in the marketplace. And that's the first time all cash has risen in 3 years, right? So we have this kind of economic wind at our back, coupled with this structural shift in the importance of housing just to the everyday Californian out there. And that really has sent us to levels that were, at one point last year at 15-year highs in terms of closed transactions, finishing the year at a 12-year high. That said, we do see signs that the market is starting to normalize a little bit. Last year was the first year that we saw investors come back into the market here in California. And I think that we can expect to gain momentum. Most of those last year were flippers rather than buy, hold, and rent. But we do see, investors coming back, institutional, mom and pop, and otherwise, because, we still have a kind of positive outlook for prices, asset prices, obviously, and housing demand, both ownership and rental. We also saw international buyers come back to the market, still a relatively small fraction of closed transactions at less than 5%. But again, starting to see that money come back into California from other parts of the world again. We also see it in terms of what folks are buying, right? At the onset of the crisis, this is the median square foot of a home purchased in California by month. And you can see at the onset of the crisis, that shot up by about 120 square feet from this kind of pre-crisis average of about 1,760 square feet. So people were going out and buying homes that would offer them, outdoor space, that would offer them home offices. Again, this kind of idea that our homes need to do more for us than ever before. We're asking them to check so many different boxes. That has started to normalize back down to that 1,750 square foot range. And I think that's a symptom of, the market kind of coming back to the core. And we talked about the Bay Area outperforming the rest of the state, last year. And I think this is kind of baked into that. I also think it's because the top end of the market, which has been growing head and shoulders faster than every other price segment, and this is year-to-year growth in closed transactions, broken up by price segment, right? And you can see here the dark blue, 2 million and up. That's been leading the recovery pretty much since the day we reopened the housing market back in May of 2020. High-end home sales have been going gangbusters, right? And we talked about how high-income earners are more insulated, folks who own stock portfolios, folks who own other property, right, that have seen tremendous appreciation are kind of outperforming that broader economy. And that's leading to this outperformance in the top end of the housing market. That's still true, right? We still see the high income earners, the kind of top 20% of the economic spectrum doing better than everyone else. But the kind of margin of outperformance has gone from, top end doing 350% year-to-year growth to just quote unquote 25, 26% over the course of the most recent time. So top end's still doing well. I'm not trying to scare you off the, home sales in Piedmont or anything like that. But I do think it's more realistic to expect that the pace of growth in that segment will start to normalize. In fact, the last 2 months, we've finally seen the share of homes at 500,000 and below be a bigger proportion of the market than home sales at $1 million and above. For a while there, $1 million and up was, we were selling even more homes $1 million and up than we were under 500,000. And again, just a sign that that market is starting to normalize a little bit. The biggest place I think you see it is when you look at the growth geographically. I already showed you Alameda County and all the individual specific cities in Oakland and Berkeley and stuff, but just look at where that 8% growth in California last year came from. It wasn't because we all moved to Bakersfield. It wasn't because we all live in the Sierra Nevada foothills outside of Visalia, et cetera, et cetera. It was because we had real, honest to goodness growth in the Bay Area, in Southern California, and to a lesser extent on the Central Coast where I live. I got asked the question before, is this like a statistical anomaly, right? Yeah, it's easy for the Bay Area to grow so much last year because they went down so much in 2020. Actually, not the case at all. If you look at the index, right? So here I'm showing you an index of closed transactions with March 2020, that pre-crisis level of transactions being 100. This way we can compare all these different areas together. You can see we don't seasonally adjust the regional data the way that we do the statewide stuff, but the dark blue, San Francisco Bay Area, isn't just posting the biggest percentage increases. It's actually the highest above that pre-crisis level relative to any other part of the state. So the good news is this isn't just a kind of nerdy statistical artifact that comes with how we calculate growth rates or anything like that. There's a real, again, genuine increase in the number of homes actually closing on the MLS. But here too, we also see signs of normalization. So here's the 2021 growth rate that I already showed you across Alameda County. Here's what the growth rate on a year-to-year basis looked like in January of 2022. For the most part, seeing similar givebacks in January to the growth that we posted in 2021. The good news is this leaves us still above pre-crisis levels, but again, doesn't suggest that we can kind of just fly off to Hawaii and throw our business in cruise control and let things take care of themselves this year. The reason I think why we want to have a nose to the grindstone type of approach. Oh, and I see a question came in. The market is resilient because there's a lot of money. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Todd. I'll talk about that when it comes to supply as well, because I think that you hit the nail on the head. We're still optimistic about closed transactions. We're just more worried about the kind of structural nature that's going to peel some buyers off at the margin, not to the detriment of the overall market, but certainly just, again, something that we got to, be working hard as individual real estate professionals, because right up against that kind of improving economy and voracious appetite for housing, what we see is that the number of homes out there for these consumers to actually purchase is incredibly depressed. If you squint at this chart, which is total active listings in California, you could see that blue bar for January 2022 is like, if you I don't have any hair, but if you pull the hair off your head, it's maybe a hair higher than what it was in December. But even by the standards of 2018 and 2019, which were terrible years for housing inventory, we're running less than half of what we had on the market even back then, right? And so for me, the concerns about inflation, which are valid, the concerns about higher rates, which are valid, I think are totally trumped by this number right here, right? There's, for me, there's no question that we're going to have more than 15,000 people who want to buy homes this year, right? The question is, what homes are you going to put them into if there's nothing, you can't sell what's not for sale ultimately, right? And you can see that the number of new listings, last chart was total active listings, right? That's just a snapshot of a moment in time. This is the flow aspect of inventory, right? How many do we add to the MLS every month? We're pulling stuff down off the shelf. How many cans of food are we putting back on that shelf, right? And you can see there that we're just simply not keeping pace with the number of home sales that we continue to do, right? So we're taking them off faster than we can put them back up on the shelf, which is why that active listings number continues to dwindle, right? We put homes onto the MLS, and just as fast or faster, they're coming right back off on the other side. And that's particularly true when it comes to the kind of entry level, right? 0 to 400,000, which is this light blue. And this is that same 15,000 or so new listings just broken up by price segment, right? But you can see 400,000 and below, in terms of price, we used to at least put, 15, 16, 1,700 homes, in that price segment on the MLS every week. The last couple of weeks, you're talking about 300, 400, 500 homes that are in that kind of entry level segment, right? And I think that the thing that really scares me is if you go back like a decade, right, or back to 2010, if you looked at the active listings, and we do a housing affordability index, which looks at how many, what percent of households can afford the median priced home. Here, I'm asking a different question. I'm just saying, of the active listings that I see on the MLS, how many of those active listings are affordable, have a price point that's affordable to somebody making $50,000 a year? And if you go back to 2010, you're talking about 2 out of every 5 listings on the MLS, a household making 50 grand a year could actually afford reasonably, right? Today being January 2022, that's fallen to less than 5% of the homes available on the housing market, or on the MLS, across the state. That means that 96% of those active listings out there, someone making 50 grand a year, or a household making 50 grand a year, can't afford. If you really want to get scared, look at the households making 200 grand a year. If you made 200 grand a year back in 2010, you could pretty much buy almost anything that was on the MLS, right? 90% of the active listings were a price point that was, that you could afford with only 30% of that $200,000 income. Now that's dwindled to the point where even if you make $200,000 a year now, 1 out of 3 of the listings that you're going to see on the MLS across the state, you can't even afford, even if you make $200,000 a year. And I think this is kind of symptomatic of the consequences of a lack of supply, right? And all this buyer demand as the homes become less affordable. If you think about, just forget percentages, right? How many of the homes out there on the MLS, this is statewide, right? How many homes on the MLS in January were affordable to a household making $100,000 a year? You used to be able to go online and look at houses, and you'd have 40,000 homes to choose from, give or take, right? In January, there was less than 4,000 homes that were at a price point that you could afford if you made 100 grand a year. Just to put that number in perspective, we have about 4 million households in California making between $75,000 and $150,000 a year, right? And so you have 4 million households, 4,000 active listings that are within reach of those households, right? And this is kind of what we're up against. What about in the local market? This is just Oakland, Berkeley added together. The number that can afford, the number of homes that are at that $530,000 price cutoff is 17. There's nothing. If you make $100,000 a year and you want to buy a house in Oakland and Berkeley, the response is it's incredibly challenging, right? And again, there too, we're talking about over 55,000 households just in Oakland and Berkeley that make 75 to 150 grand a year, fighting over the 17 active listings that are below, $550,000. Forget about by price point, right? What about just total active listings? We're talking about less than 200 actives right now in the city of Oakland, in the cities of Oakland and Berkeley, again, spread across more than 200,000 households in just those 2 cities alone. And so, we're not pessimistic about the trajectory of the housing market, but this is going to prevent us. This lack of supply is going to mean, just mathematically, that you can't hang on to 15-year highs for transactions when the homes aren't actually coming onto the market for sale. That's why prices, even as they're, down a little bit from where they were at the end of last year seasonally, they're still growing by, essentially a double-digit pace, 9.4% still from where we were at the beginning of 2021. And that comes right at the cost of housing affordability, right? You can see now, that there's only two counties in all of California that have better housing affordability than what you see in the rest of the United States. Even our most affordable markets in California are less affordable than most other parts of the United States. This is our traditional housing affordability index, but you can see Alameda County's in the teens, right? It's the seventh least affordable market in California, even taking into account the higher incomes that people make in Alameda County. You're talking about 4 out of 5 not able to afford the median priced home. And I think that is the big challenge going forward. A, that we don't have enough, supply to put these buyers into, and B, we're peeling off potential buyers at the margin because of this lack of inventory. And that's before we even start talking about some of this external stuff, right? That, inflation, and I hate to show you this chart, but I do it not just to justify my student loans, but also just to kind of, underscore that this is the thing that the Fed's paying attention to, and that continues to run relatively hot. And that means they'll probably raise rates in the next couple of weeks when they meet in March, and they'll probably raise rates another 3+ times thereafter. We've already seen 30-year fixed rate mortgages increase by about 130 basis points. And this is the Freddie Mac number, right? So we've gone from 2.65 at the start of last year to 3.92 as of 2 weeks ago. If you look at the Mortgage Daily News daily quotes for 30-year fixed rate mortgages, they're already around 4.1%, right? And that's the kind of double whammy when it comes to consumer pocketbooks. Here I'm showing you the effect, and this is our $830,000 median priced home. What I'm showing you is the payment on that home at different levels of interest rates, just going from 3% where we were at the beginning of the year to 4% where we essentially are now. We've added almost $400 a month to the monthly payment of that median priced home. Consequently, it just happens to be very similar to the median single family price in Oakland, I think, as of January. But every 50 basis points, you're talking about another $200, right? Going to 4.5 is another $200. Going to 5% is another roughly $200. And you can think about places like Berkeley with higher median home prices in the $1.1 million range. That has an even bigger magnified effect. In fact, if you look at the growth in monthly mortgage payment instead of the growth in median home price, you can see that kind of that double whammy effect, right? Median prices were only up 9.4% in January year to year, but the payment on that median priced home went up by almost 20%, right? Because the price of the home's higher and we got to pay more for that monthly, carrying cost on the mortgage payment. And again, that's going to be a headwind for the buyer demand. We already have 4 out of 5 Californians in our monthly consumer survey telling us that it's not a good time to buy a home. They are passionate about home ownership. They want to get into the market. They want to take advantage of low rates, but they don't feel particularly optimistic that they're getting a great deal out there. And we saw that in the kind of competitiveness numbers. And eventually, and for me, this is why I've been harping on about supply for so many years, is because eventually, your supply problems go on for so long that they kind of metastasize into demand problems. And here you can see the number of new purchase mortgage applications has now been falling for 7 months in a row, very consistently year-to-year declines every single week. Our monthly pending sales index here in California has also been falling now for the last 8 months in a row, most recently by almost 17%. So, a lot of these supply challenges are bleeding over and preventing us, not from seeing a healthy market, but just preventing us from hanging on to this momentum that we've had, this 15-year high of transactions where we've got plenty of buyers out there to fuel that, just not enough supply to put them in. But there is a demand component to this. And that's why I bring it up, because supply, although, the paramount challenge facing California is not the only thing. There is some weakness on the demand side as well. If it was only the lack of listings, and again, I'm in full agreement that that's the biggest problem, but if it was the only problem, you wouldn't see median time on market going from 7 days late last year to 12 days last month. Similarly, you wouldn't see the percentage of homes closing above ask price go from 72% or so to less than 60% last month. That's still an incredibly competitive market, right? I'm not trying to scare you off the marketplace. What I'm trying to do is make sure that you very much take a kind of data-driven elbow grease type of approach to your business, because you have buyers who are getting fatigued out there. They need to be talked back into the game. They need to be reminded that we're still at basically rates that are at all-time low levels, that the benefits of home ownership in terms of wealth creation, improvement in your kids' lives, high school graduation rates, health outcomes, all of that stuff is very much alive and well. Forget about timing the market, get into a house for the long haul, because we're going to have to start having those conversations again, and it's all due to the lack of supply. The good news again is that I'm not trying to scare you off the market. Yes, mortgage applications have fallen from where they were last year. They're still above pre-crisis level. Same thing that we saw in terms of sales, right, which are also above pre-crisis levels. Same thing with the pending sales. They fallen by 17% from where they were last year. That still leaves us above where we were for the preceding decade leading into this crisis. You just, again, want to make sure that you're not taking it for granted and thinking that we can just ride this wave of an improving economy and a renewed passion for home ownership and think that it means all this new market share of transactions for us as realtors. The public health situation is just going to add to the improvement, hopefully, in the economy. And I'm very encouraged by what we see in terms of new cases over the last couple of weeks here in California. And you can see the rule changes coming down the pike as we speak. Rates are still very, very low from a historical standpoint, right? Yes, when I showed you that 1 year chart, it seems scary. They went from 2.6 to almost 4%, right? Look what happens when you take that 1 year chart and you zoom it out on the history since Freddie Mac's been tracking mortgage interest rates, and it's still a phenomenal time to get your foot on the property ladder, especially as we expect rates to continue to go up in the future, right? But we need to get those buyers focused back on the prize, not trying to be these kind of whiz-bang financial experts that are timing the market absolutely perfect and buying low and selling high and doing all this kind of crazy financial engineering. No, you get in at a low rate, you use the bank's money to make this beautiful investment in an asset that continues to appreciate with a business partner in the bank or the mortgage lender that's not asking you to split profits with them. It's a one of a kind investment opportunity for regular people in this country. And of course, those that did that, and this is where I'll end, is that folks who bought a home, lived in it for at least 5 years and sold it, accumulated an incredible amount of home equity. The net cash gain that we saw of home sellers who lived in those homes is just off the charts, right? And this is the opportunity the buyer should really be focused in on: getting in at a low rate, living there for a while, and making a boatload of money. And oh, by the way, you get to live there for, while you're at it. So that's where the conversation needs to get back to, because the economy is going well, right? We have GDP growing. We have, job growth continuing at about a 3% clip. We have unemployment in the rest of the United States continuing to fall to basically pre-crisis levels. We have California actually economically outperforming the rest of the United States, as we've already been doing up to this point for the last 6 months. We have more job growth. We have a bigger improvement in unemployment. We even have population growth starting to come back, albeit at a fairly negligible level. It beats a population that's falling. But when you kind of superimpose that on the housing market, it doesn't mean all this growth in transactions, right? We still have about a 420,000 unit pace projected for 2022. That'll be about a 5% decline from where we were last year. Not because we don't have enough buyers or because there's a foreclosure crisis or because people don't believe in home ownership, purely because we don't have enough homes to put these buyers into. That's why prices are going to keep going up by about 5% as well, to a new record of almost 830,000 statewide. That means Alameda County is probably going to continue to grow in that kind of $1.3 million range that it's already been in. But again, it's going to come at the cost of housing affordability. So I think for me, it's just and it's an optimistic time. We got an economy that's improving. We got a housing market that continues to outperform that broader economy. But we've got a lot of headwinds facing our consumers, and we've got to work twice as hard for it as real estate professionals. So I think if you keep that nose to the grindstone attitude, then the, all of the kind of ingredients are there for 2022 to be a phenomenal year. But you just want to make sure that we keep that nose to the grindstone. So with that, I'll say thanks to Kieran for having me, and thank you all for your time. And if I haven't beat you into submission yet, I'll look at the chat and see if there's any questions that I can entertain. And I see there's some here. The slides will both be available. Yeah, so I see Keith asked, where can we get a copy of these slides? And I'll send these through to Bridge, and I'll also post them on car.org so that you can download them. It usually takes about a day for my folks on the website to get those posted, but they'll be up there. Yes, and Todd said the 322,000 net cash gain, maybe on a 20% down payment. Yes, that's the point that I was trying to make inelegantly, and why, housing is the one leveraged investment that regular people can make, right? If I have, and sometimes you hear that argument like, hey, you can invest your money in the stock market and do just as well as you can through home ownership. That's like one of the common criticisms against home ownership. And like, yes, you can put together a mathematical model on paper that says if you take your money and invest it in the stock market, you can end up just as well off or better than if you bought a home. The thing I would point out is that never actually happens in reality. If you go look at the Fed survey on consumer household wealth in America, the wealth of renters is $6,000. That's in real terms the exact same number that it was back in the early 1980s. The wealth of people who own homes continues to go up, right? And so the proof is in the pudding. The other thing I would say is that it's a leveraged investment, right? If I have $100,000 as an example, and I invest that in the stock market, I'm in $100,000 position, right? If I take my $100 and invest in the housing market, many times I'm in at least a $500,000 position, and I don't have to split profits, right? So, if the house goes from 500 to 600,000, I made 100 grand. The bank doesn't come back and say, hey, 80% of that money was mine. I get 80% of the price appreciation. And that is a unique thing, right? And so that's why even if the stock market does go up faster, right? Take our $100,000 example. If you want to make 15 grand off your $100,000 investment, if you put it into the stock market, you need the stock market to go up by 15%, right? 100 grand to 115,000. If you take your 100 grand and put it into housing, a $500,000 home only has to go up by 3% for you to have made 15 grand, right? So you need the stock market to go up 5 times faster to make the same exact amount of money, because most of the money that you're putting in isn't your own, right? And that is why, guys like me, who's the son of a high school dropout, can be here doing speeches like this. It's not because, my dad was this whiz bang financial savant or anything like that. He bought his own home, he, borrowed at a reasonable cost. Actually, I'm the son of a guy who used to brag about his 12.5% mortgage interest rate. So reasonable interest rate is a relative term, but that's why I also think, 4% isn't probably going to be the major thing that derails the housing market, right? Like anybody who isn't hyper focused on what's been happening the last 2 years, 4% is basically still the lowest interest rates of all time. And so I think that, again, that the benefits of home ownership are alive and well, and that's what buyers should be focused on, right? Rates are still low and probably going to be higher later. So are prices, right? So you're just going to pay even more money at even higher interest rates and lose out on a bunch of home equity in the meantime versus, getting your foot on that ladder and moving forward. So hopefully those kind of data-driven approaches and conversations with buyers will help. Barry asked if I could speak to the difference between condo and SFR. Interestingly, it's part of the normalization. I didn't want to, beat that to death too bad, but actually, if you go back to 2020 as an example, when single family was falling by 30-40% in 2020 at that very onset of the crisis, condos were falling by 40-50-60%. They were falling even more. They were contracting more as people moved out to Tahoe, as they wanted those homes with bigger space. Now, as we're seeing that homegrown demand come back to Oakland, Berkeley, which are outperforming, people are buying smaller homes again. People are actually starting to buy condos again. But, and I think this kind of gets to your point, is that, there's an inventory crisis on the condo front too, right? This is across every single type of housing. It's across rental housing, single family, multifamily, duplex, own, rent, etc. And so you do see condos losing momentum as condos came back. I think last year when single family was growing by like 40 and 50%, we had like 120% growth in June in condo sales. And the kind of unfortunate side effect of that is that we now no longer have very many condos out there on the MLS. Good. I think I did now finally beat you in the submission, but I work for you all, and my email is jordanl@car.org. So if you have questions about these slides or something that you didn't want to ask in front of the whole group, or something comes up down the road, you have a client that wants to know about X, Y, or Z, just reach out and let me know. I work for you, and when you're getting more people into homes, making more money, then I'm living my dream, and so I'm happy to do it. And I hope you take me up on my offer if you need it.